So last month, for our April update, we looked at how tension inside of the Disney company around CEO Bob Chapek has built for years, finally erupting over the Florida House Bill 1557, the Parental Rights in Education Act, or what is often called the Don't Say Gay Bill. At that point, Chapek faced criticism from employees inside the company, from government officials in Florida, and from social action and political groups. And over the past 4 weeks, things have only gotten worse. At the moment, the Disney-backed special district in Florida called the Reedy Creek Improvement District is in a type of legal jeopardy. It's possible that it may be dissolved, removing a good deal of Disney's control from the resort. It's possible, too, that it won't. This is an element of the Florida resort that dates back to the days of Roy Disney. As we move through our update today, I think I have some possible answers as to where this all will likely lead. This is our monthly news and analysis episode in which we look at large stories presently shaping the Disney company. And this month, again, we have one story that is far larger than the rest, a story that might be described as the ongoing battle between the governor of Florida and the state's largest employer. In our update today, we'll talk about what has happened, what it means, and what are some possible paths forward for the company. It's a wild ride in which nothing, including state laws, is exactly what it seems. To start with, let's discuss what exactly is the Reedy Creek Improvement District. This is one important key to understanding our current problems. In 1964, when Walt Disney sent Bob Foster to look for land in Florida, Walt was interested in creating a new resort area that the company could fully control. One of the problems with Disneyland in California, according to Walt, was that cheap motels and restaurants had sprung up around the park, making the area look like a low-rent Las Vegas. As with a movie in which Walt managed the image completely on screen, he now wanted visual and experiential control of the land around the resort he wanted to build in Florida. Originally, Walt was interested in 5,000 to 10,000 acres, enough land for a park, a recreation area, and hotels, as well as a visual buffer from anything that might be built in nearby areas. But while Foster was exploring land options in Central Florida, Walt's vision for the property expanded beyond a theme park and hotels. He now wanted to build one city, or at times two cities. Walt's interest in urban planning grew out of his experience with a Palm Beach Gardens development, his experience with a rejuvenation project in St. Louis, and his experience with a planned urban area in Kansas City. If you're interested in any of these stories, there are detailed accounts of these developments in our podcast series, The Book of Hench, and also in Walt Disney and Riverfront Square. With the addition of urban and industrial areas in the proposed Florida project, Walt wanted at least twice as much land to create a larger and more complex development. The infrastructure and planning units required to build the modern city, or cities, along with an industrial area, a resort, a recreation area, and a theme park, exceeded what local governments in Central Florida in the late 1960s could support. Orange County, where much of the Disneyland was located, held small towns and mostly was supported by an agricultural community. After acquiring the acreage, Bob Foster worked with Florida government to propose that the land owned by Disney be managed as an improvement district, which would function as a government body. Officially, the area would be called the Reedy Creek Improvement District. Reedy Creek would not be owned by Disney, but would be arranged to work closely with Disney to facilitate the building of roads and land improvements, manage the environment, develop basic services such as a fire department and a sewage system, and develop a permitting system for construction for the theme park, hotels, and recreation areas. The improvement district would also have an organized plan to regulate and manage growth as it saw fit to support the resort. In essence, the district would manage zoning outside of county and state regulations. Reedy Creek would be overseen by 5 supervisors who were elected by the handful of residents that would live within the district. Presently, there's about 70 people, most either Disney employees or retired Disney employees who live within the district. Initially, the district was arranged to govern a city like the one Walt proposed, but following Walt's death, that city never materialized. The job of the district now is to primarily support the resort. The Reedy Creek Act was brought to Florida's legislature months after Walt's death. At that time, some in Florida were concerned that Disney might abandon the Florida property entirely and instead focus on a smaller development in another state. As a project as large as Disney World would be difficult to develop without a charismatic leader like Walt to solidify arrangements with sponsors and various companies. In May 1967, Governor Claude Kirk signed the act into law creating the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which would contain 2 cities, the city of Bay Lake and the city of Reedy Creek, which was later renamed the city of Lake Buena Vista. The act allowed Reedy Creek to create a building department, which was overseen by the state, same as other building departments, and would manage development on property. The building code was similar, if slightly more strict, than most building codes elsewhere in Florida. Disney World, like all businesses and property owners, paid taxes to state and local governments, including Orange and Osceola counties. But Reedy Creek was able to tax Disney an additional fee to maintain various services and public works areas necessary to run the resort. The Disney businesses, such as the Magic Kingdom, paid an additional tax to Reedy Creek, as well as a second tax to the Reedy Creek city in which they were located, such as the city of Bay Lake. Presently, this additional amount is roughly $160 million per year for the entire Disney property. Reedy Creek is authorized as a special district to tax its residents, namely Disney, at a far higher rate than allowed elsewhere in the state. Think of this as an extremely large homeowners association fee that a property owner would pay in addition to county and state taxes. In exchange for maintaining their own public works areas, the improvement district is essentially allowed to work with Disney directly in terms of building permits and plannings. There are some civic advantages to this plan for local residents. A few miles north on the I-4, Universal, which pays less tax overall than Disney and is not in a special district, can push some public works costs onto the county. Recently, Universal worked with Orange County to create a new road that cost an estimated $300 million, a road that will lead to their new Epic Universe Park. The company paid about $160 million, Orange County paid about $125 million, and the state paid roughly $16 million. If a similar project were arranged on Disney property, Reedy Creek would pay for the full amount. As Disney World developed from its original resort area with 2 hotels, 1 theme park, and a campground, Reedy Creek helped Disney facilitate its growth in multiple ways. Like a traditional government, Reedy Creek could sell bonds to raise capital to build roads, public buildings, and complete various work projects. In its early years, bonds were a tool that Reedy Creek used to raise millions of dollars to develop roads inside the Disney property at an extremely low interest rate, lower than what Disney as a company itself would receive, as Reedy Creek was a government. Also in the late 1960s, Orange and Osceola counties were financially unable to create the roads necessary for the resort. From this standpoint, the improvement district was a practical necessity. It was a way to create infrastructure without overburdening the 2 counties. At the moment, Reedy Creek has about $900 million in outstanding bond debt that it will pay off over time using part of the $160 million it raises each year through the improvement tax that it levies against Disney. In this, Reedy Creek ensures that special services necessary to support an extremely large area are working at a high rate of efficiency. For example, public work areas, considering that at peak times the resort holds 250,000 guests, are rarely broken or inactive. Inside of the Reedy Creek district are a network of roads, most of which are owned and maintained by Reedy Creek. If you've been to Disney World, these are the roads that, like a highway system, take you through the property with various off-ramps, overpasses, and cloverleafs. Beyond these, the property does have some smaller roads privately owned by Disney, such as the road through the Animal Kingdom Lodge area or the roads inside of Fort Wilderness. These roads Disney, as a company, maintains rather than Reedy Creek. On a personal note, the funding of Reedy Creek is large enough that I've never even seen a pothole on one of their roads. Reedy Creek also provides quick review of building plans and permits required for Disney projects. Building plans are still reviewed in a manner consistent with the underlying building code, which is subject to state regulation. But as Disney is the primary entity in the improvement district, Reedy Creek can focus on those plans in a way that is extremely efficient and fast. Simple plans can be reviewed in days as opposed to months. If Disney were to work instead with a county office, they would need to line up behind thousands of other residents each time a permit was needed for one of their projects. In terms of general taxes, Disney pays roughly the same percentage rate to Orange County and Osceola County as do other business and homeowners in the counties. These taxes cover schools, water management, general services, public works, libraries, and so on. But Disney pays those two additional taxes, the first to the Reedy Creek Improvement District and the second to either the City of Bay Lake or the City of Lake Buena Vista, depending on where the Disney Park, hotel, or other business is located. This doubles the overall property tax rate for Disney businesses. In terms of a property tax percentage, Disney pays twice what Universal or SeaWorld pays specifically to maintain the improvement district. In fairness, I should point out there are probably some elements of the 1967 Reedy Creek Act that can now be sunsetted and are no longer necessary, as Disney never created a city. Therefore, the Reedy Creek Improvement District doesn't need all of the powers it was originally granted. For example, maybe a private company doesn't need the power to open and manage a large airport for commercial jets. The original act does give Disney this power, but let's put that aside for the moment and focus on how this story exploded over the past month. On April 20th, the Florida State Senate passed a bill to dissolve special improvement districts formed in Florida before 1968, which included the Reedy Creek Improvement District. The move to strip the improvement district status from Disney property was seen by some as a retaliatory move by the state government for Disney's public stance against the Don't Say Gay bill. Some legislators even publicly tied the effort to dissolve Reedy Creek to Disney's comments about the new law. On Squawk Box, State Representative Randy Fine discussed the state legislature's reaction to Disney's statements about the earlier bill. Quote, "When Disney kicked the hornet's nest, we looked at special districts. Disney had the political power to prevent it for decades. What changed is bringing California values to Florida. Floridians said, 'You are a guest. Maybe you don't deserve special privileges anymore.'" The bill to dissolve Reedy Creek was then passed by the House of Representatives and signed by Governor DeSantis. Immediately after the bill was passed, Senator Linda Stewart, who had discussed the matter with Disney, learned that there was an existing Florida statute that might prevent the state government from dissolving an active district through the legislature. The statute explained that for the legislature to dissolve such a district, the act must be approved by a majority of resident electors of the district. Again, there are about 70 residents of Reedy Creek, most being either current or past Disney employees. But as residents didn't approve Reedy Creek back in 1967, this might not be necessary to dissolve it. At least for the time being, the act moved forward, and this objection was set aside. And here's where things begin to get messy. If the improvement district was dissolved, the counties that absorbed Reedy Creek, at least with the current resolution, would likely absorb the $900 million of bond debt. They would also need to pay for services and public works projects inside of Reedy Creek out of a general county budget. Reedy Creek, as an improvement district, had the ability to levy a special tax on its residents, namely Disney, that it then could use to support services inside the district. But if the district was dissolved and the area was absorbed generally into Orange and Osceola counties, the funds required to run services in the resort areas would need to be covered by general county taxes, as counties were unable to tax one landowner at a higher rate than another landowner. These counties would need to raise land taxes on all residents to cover services around the Disney resort area. Without the special district and the unique ability to levy taxes, Disney would no longer be required to pay that special tax. This would add an additional financial burden of roughly $163 million to Orange and Osceola counties, along with those counties absorbing the nearly $1 billion in bond debt. For Orange County residents, this would raise property taxes by about 20%. At least that was the estimate of the county tax commissioner. Depending on individual land values, annual increases for an owner of a single-family home could increase between $100,000 to $200,000 for more costly homes. These additional taxes would be necessary to run the reconfigured counties, yet residents affected had no means to vote for or against the increase. Such an increase would also bring property taxes in these two counties to a level higher than allowed by current Florida law. One odd side note here. If this went through, Universal and SeaWorld would see their property taxes raised by millions of dollars each year to pay for services on Disney property that Disney used to pay themselves. Disney then would also see their overall tax burden go down by tens of millions of dollars, as without Reedy Creek, the counties themselves would have no tax vehicle through which to collect a special tax on Disney property. At this point, as these things became clear to everyone in Tallahassee, the state government began to acknowledge that the bill was meaningfully flawed and would require additional legislation, though the governor's office wasn't backing away from the dissolution of the improvement district. On Monday, May 25th, Governor DeSantis issued a statement, quote, "In the near future, we will propose additional legislation to authorize additional special districts in a manner that ensures transparency and an even playing field under the law." In short, the governor's office was beginning to grapple with the unintended financial effects of dissolving Reedy Creek, though no details were announced as to how this might work. I should point out that a new bill was proposed just 4 days after that original bill was passed into law to correct large problems in it, which is never a sign of strong planning. On April 27th, the Reedy Creek Board of Supervisors met for the first time since the dissolution bill was passed. The wording of the bill allowed for the current district to exist until June 2023, roughly for 14 months. The supervisors didn't talk much about the bill, but instead focused on other business. As a result of the proposed dissolution, they noted that a solar project was having trouble securing financing in the current environment, as those who would otherwise purchase Reedy Creek bonds were concerned about who would now repay them if the district was dissolved. Beyond this, longtime employees with the Reedy Creek Fire Department also expressed concern that their lifetime health benefits might be lost if the district was dissolved, as those benefits were guaranteed through Reedy Creek. Another unexpected impact of the bill was revealed on Thursday, April 28th. Fitch, an agency that rates the reliability of bonds, downgraded the Reedy Creek bond debt to negative watch because it was now uncertain who would ultimately be responsible for repayment. On their website, Fitch explained the downgrade. Quote, "The Florida state government's move to dissolve several independent special districts on June 1st, 2023, creates significant risk to the credit quality of these districts, including Reedy Creek Improvement District. The RCID, that is the Reedy Creek Improvement District, dissolution bill is outside our baseline expectation for the sector, as it creates ambiguity around which entity or entities will ultimately repay bondholders, which carries adverse consequences for RCID's credit quality and was a significant factor in the negative watch." More significantly, though, Fitch suggested that the state's actions, essentially dissolving entities that had the abilities to sell municipal bonds, quote, "could alter our view of Florida's commitment to preserve bondholder rights and weaken our view of the operating environment for Florida governments." In other words, they believed that the dissolution of Reedy Creek, if the state had the power to dissolve such districts, would cause them to lower the rating on all Florida bond debt, meaning that government bond debt across the entire state would carry higher interest rates and be more difficult to secure. The bill that had been passed by the legislature a week or so earlier could now raise interest on all new bonds for all entities in Florida. That same day, the Washington Post published an article based on unnamed sources that tried to outline how Disney was managing the situation. Quote, "Sources familiar with the negotiations who request anonymity to discuss private negotiations say the company's lobbyists and lawyers have been working behind the scenes to find a solution that would allow DeSantis to, quote, save face and continue to claim victory over, quote, woke culture, while in reality doing very little to impede the company's massive operations in Florida." A lobbyist who works with state government but is not retained by Disney offered this observation. Quote, "Disney won't rock the boat. They'll have private conversations with members and staff once things cool off a bit and come up with a plan to get what they want. Part of the conversation is they won't wade back into those issues and DeSantis will move on to another topic." In Central Florida, during the 3rd and 4th weeks of April, on multiple channels, the dissolution of Reedy Creek was the lead story night after night after night, as residents in those counties might be on the hook for millions in expenses. At this point, days after the bill became law, it was clear to most in the state that the 2-page bill was poorly conceived and executed. For the press, DeSantis insisted that they would develop a second bill that would solve problems with the first bill, particularly with the near $1 billion of bond debt. At least in public, and in contrast to the story offered by the Washington Post, DeSantis wasn't working quietly to manage the situation with Disney. Instead, he was inflaming the situation. Quote, "The bonds will be paid by Disney," DeSantis insisted. "They will be paying taxes, probably more taxes. They will follow the laws that every person has to do, and they will no longer have the ability to run their own government." On Fox News, he also said, quote, "There's going to be additional legislative action, so stay tuned." What wasn't acknowledged by DeSantis in these statements was that Disney was already paying the same property tax rates as other businesses in Orange and Osceola counties. The issue now was the extra tax that only Disney had been paying for decades. A few days later, on May 2nd, Democratic senators explained DeSantis' updated plan. Quote, "They expect Governor DeSantis to establish a new special district run by his own appointees to oversee Walt Disney World property after dissolving RCID." The senators questioned whether this would be legally feasible. But again, this served to escalate tensions between Disney and the state government rather than to ease them. On May 3rd, 2 residents from Osceola County and 1 from Orange County began the process to sue the state of Florida in federal court over the issue of increased county debt likely to be forced onto residents. The residents requested that the bill to dissolve Reedy Creek should be declared unconstitutional, as it will create, quote, "significant injury to taxpayers." The suit claimed that the bill violates a state law called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Among the defendants' name was Ron DeSantis. By this point, Disney had a number of legal options. It could claim that its First Amendment rights had been violated. Many state legislators, on TV, radio, and in the press, essentially explained that the dissolution of Reedy Creek was in retaliation for the company's stand on the Don't Say Gay bill. That issue could be explored in federal court as free speech. Essentially, company executives expressing opinions on politics was a protected right. But there were other, perhaps more effective tools that Disney might use to attack the bill. The dissolution of Reedy Creek would disrupt contracts that the state is legally obligated to support. The following sentences are from a Bloomberg tax analysis which examined the issue from the perspective of Florida and U.S. law. Quote, both the U.S. and Florida constitutions place strict limitations on a government's ability to impair its own contracts. Under the U.S. Constitution, a state can only impair an existing contract if the impairment is reasonable and necessary to serve an important government purpose. The Florida Constitution provides even greater protection from impairment of contracts. With this law that dissolves Reedy Creek, the state of Florida has eliminated the government entity that backed various bonds while violating its own explicit promise not to do so. It is hard to imagine a way that the state could successfully argue that this did not violate its own contractual obligations or unconstitutionally impair the contract between Reedy Creek and bondholders. Florida could theoretically get rid of some of these contractual issues by writing a giant check to prepay or redeem the bonds, but that's prevented by at least one of the outstanding bonds. 2018's utility revenue bond prohibits redemption before October of 2029. In short, the 1967 Act, arranged by the state government, promised that the state could not, quote, limit or alter the rights of Reedy Creek to collect taxes, raise revenues through bonds and other tax vehicles. The dissolution of the district, at least as presently proposed, would mean that the state was violating the act that 55 years ago the state itself created and would open itself up to various lawsuits. Perhaps, though, it might be possible for the state of Florida to sidestep the issue by simply paying off Reedy Creek's bond debt, but Reedy Creek presently has that bond tied to utilities that, as part of its terms, can't be redeemed until October 2029, which means, in short, that unless the state were to violate its own law, Reedy Creek would need to exist until October 2029 when the bond becomes due. If the debt were shifted to another entity, bondholders could sue because the shift in contract might make the bond less valuable, particularly if the new guarantor were viewed as slightly less reliable than the Disney-backed Reedy Creek. To look at this from a slightly cynical perspective for a moment, as Reedy Creek isn't scheduled to be dissolved until June 2023, I believe that there is nothing to prevent the Improvement District from issuing another bond that, by its terms, couldn't be redeemed for 50 or even 100 years. The bond, of course, would need to be tied to the essential business of the district, but there's ongoing roadwork all over the property, and Reedy Creek has been criticized for years that the resources at its 4 fire stations are now inadequate for the present size of the resort. There's one station near the Magic Kingdom, one near the Epcot Resort area, one roughly between Hollywood Studios and Animal Kingdom, and one near Disney Springs. But there are a couple of areas not particularly close to a fire department, such as Fort Wilderness and Port Orleans. Another fire station, as well as a couple of hook and ladder trucks, would not only make the property safer, but if it were paid for with a 50-year bond that couldn't be redeemed early, might also extend the existence of Reedy Creek into 2072. Again, from another slightly cynical perspective, one of the elements that might be driving this issue forward is campaign finance for politicians who have supported the bill. The Washington Post noted that the primary political committee fundraising for Governor DeSantis, quote, collected more than $7.2 million the month after he started criticizing Disney, a monthly total the committee exceeded only 3 other times in the past 18 months. This actually may be part of the overall intention of the bill. Along with no financial analysis report, the bill also had no implementation plan, which, from a certain standpoint, might suggest that legislators never believed that it would be implemented. Rather, it may have been a public tool to define political viewpoints of state leaders, a tool arranged with a 2-page bill that wouldn't need to be resolved or implemented until after the November elections were long over. The challenges around these issues, if not settled quickly, will take years to move through the courts, and I doubt that's where we are really headed. I also expect a special improvement district, more or less in its current form, to continue for many years around the Disney property. But I do expect there to be a significant reduction to the Lake Nona campus Disney was planning in Florida, and also a shift of investment and development dollars away from Florida to other Disney parks and resorts around the world. I expect that it will take years for a subsequent governing body in Florida to repair relationships with its largest private employer, which is Walt Disney World. The dispute with Florida government is also placing negative pressure on Disney stock. The stock presently is hovering around $109, which is down 45% since March 2021, and it's down 30% in the past 10 weeks since the difficulties between Disney and the Florida government first emerged. And none of this is playing well for Disney CEO Bob Chapek, who has been noticeably absent from public presentations since the Florida bill was passed to dissolve the special district. As we discussed in our last monthly update, in recent months, Chapek has been criticized by his own employees, both liberal and conservative groups, state governments, and financial analysts. His contract with Disney will expire next February, and there's a question whether, if with the current damage in Florida, the Disney board will renew him for another term. This past month has not helped his case, but also we are still many months away from the February deadline. But let's end here on something that resembles a positive note. In terms of Reedy Creek and government control of the Disney area, if all else fails, Disney could transfer governing powers to the 2 cities inside of its property, Bay Lake and Lake Buena Vista. These cities could perform more or less the same functions as the Reedy Creek Improvement District. The current 2-page bill only covers the dissolution of improvement districts, which is only one way that Disney can, in essence, self-govern. Quote, part of the reason Disney created these 2 cities is they knew that the state could eliminate the improvement district by a majority vote of the state legislature, said Chad Emerson, an attorney who has studied Reedy Creek. They can't do this with cities. There's a much more extensive process. And so, these cities were basically 2 safety valves in case a legislature did something to the improvement district like they just did last week. And so, as we move into the month of May, this is where we are with one of the biggest stories to affect the Florida resort in years. I'll be back next week with a new episode that looks at how the Disney resort in Florida moved through the early days of the pandemic when everything was closed. We'll also look at what has recently reopened, and we'll answer this question. How does a designer in a theme park tell a new story by only adding and managing light? Over the next few days, you can think about how you might solve that design challenge. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studios and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support us by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.